All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're going to tackle a question that's been a hot topic among Christians for almost 200 years. Where did the whole idea of the rapture actually come from? The source material we're looking at today has a pretty bold answer that really challenges the story you've probably heard before. So this is it. This one question is really the heart of the entire debate. And according to the material we're digging into, it's a question that's built on a major misunderstanding of history.
Now, if you've ever looked into this at all, this story probably sounds super familiar. It's the standard narrative you hear almost everywhere, that the rapture is a modern idea, basically dreamt up in the 1800s by a guy named John Nelson Darby. But, and this is a big but, the source for today's explainer comes back with this really direct, really forceful claim. It argues that this popular story is, and I'm quoting here, simply not true. And that one statement pretty much sets the stage for everything we're about to get into. So this brings us to our first big question. If the whole Darby invented it story isn't true, like our source claims, then why is it so popular? Why does it have such staying power? Well, our source offers up a few key reasons. First, the claim just sounds academic, right? It gives it this air of authority. It also suggests that it can make someone feel kind of smart, like they know some secret history. But here's the crucial point from this perspective. If you can label a belief a recent invention, it gives you an easy out. You can just dismiss it without ever having to really deal with its core ideas, especially, the source says, the ones that are supernatural and maybe a little uncomfortable.
Okay, so now that we've looked at why that modern invention story might be so sticky, let's get to the main evidence our source brings to the table. And this evidence comes from people who are writing centuries, even over 1,000 years before John Darby was even born.
Now, what's really wild about this is the sheer scale of time you're seeing here. Just look at it. You've got names from the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries, and then this massive, massive jump all the way to the 1800s for Darby. The argument here is pretty clear. The basic ideas were around long, long before him. And this just drives the point home. We're talking about writings that came out more than 1,400 years before Darby. This huge historical gap is really the foundation of the source's entire argument against that modern invention theory. Our source points to this quote from a guy named Ephraim the Syrian back in the 4th century as kind of a smoking gun. Just listen to the phrases here: gather together before the tribulation and taken to the Lord. The source argues this is a crystal clear description of a pre-tribulation removal of believers, written centuries and centuries before the idea was supposedly invented. Okay, the next piece of this historical puzzle is a theological idea called imminence. It sounds complicated, but it's actually pretty simple. It's not just the belief that Jesus will return someday, but the very specific belief that he could return at any second, with no warning signs needed. And according to our source, this idea was a really big deal to the early church. So here's how the logic works, according to our source. It argues that if the early church truly believed in imminence, that Jesus could return at any moment, then they couldn't also have believed that they had to go through a whole laundry list of specific prophesied tribulations first. The two ideas, from this point of view, just don't work together. So this brings us back around to John Darby. If he didn't invent the doctrine, then what exactly was his role in all this? Well, this next section completely reframes his contribution. Our source draws a really sharp line in the sand here. Was Darby an inventor, someone who created something totally new out of nothing? Or was he a systematizer, someone who takes existing ideas that are kind of scattered all over the place and organizes them into a clear, understandable structure? The source argues he's definitely in that second category. So what did Darby actually do? Well, according to this view, he organized all these concepts into a formal system, he preached it really effectively to a lot of people, and he connected it to a bigger way of looking at the Bible called dispensationalism. So, in short, the argument is that he was a hugely influential organizer and clarifier, but not the creator. And this slide makes the point using a really powerful analogy. The source says that accusing Darby of inventing the rapture is a lot like accusing Augustine of inventing original sin, or saying Martin Luther invented the idea of justification by faith. The point is that these guys didn't just make these ideas up. They clarified them, organized them, and really championed them at key moments in history. Okay, so let's follow the breadcrumbs. The argument traces this idea back even further than those early church fathers. It goes all the way back to the biblical texts themselves. The source argues that the true origin of the doctrine isn't in the 1800s or even the 300s, but in the New Testament.
It points to several key passages as the foundation. Paul talking about believers being caught up, the promise of being delivered from a future wrath, and this mysterious idea of a restrainer being taken out of the world. These, it claims, are the real building blocks of the doctrine. And beyond even the apostles, the source points to this direct promise from Jesus as the ultimate foundation. The argument here is simple. John Darby didn't put these verses in the Bible. He just organized and emphasized what, according to this perspective, was already there. So why does any of this matter? Why does this historical debate get so heated? Our final section explores the source's explanation for what's really at stake. The source suggests that focusing so much on one guy, John Darby, and one specific time, the 1830s, is actually a strategic move. It allows critics to write off the entire doctrine as some newfangled idea, which is a convenient way to avoid having to actually argue against the scriptural passages themselves. And to counter that, the source points back to church history. It makes the point that other absolutely central Christian doctrines like the Trinity, or even which books made it into the Bible, were formally clarified in the 300s, hundreds of years after Jesus. Justification by faith wasn't clarified until the 1500s. So this argument goes, just because something was clarified late doesn't mean it was invented late. And this brings us to what our source thinks is the real motivation behind all this. It suggests the real target isn't John Darby at all. The real issue, it claims, is a discomfort with how profoundly supernatural the whole doctrine is. A literal supernatural rescue, a physical return of Christ, and a real future period of tribulation and judgment. So we'll end with this summary from the source material because it really wraps up the entire argument we've explored today in a nutshell. It's the idea that the doctrine's roots are ancient and biblical, and that Darby's role wasn't as an inventor, but as a clarifier who brought an old hope back into the spotlight. It's a fascinating perspective in a debate that is definitely still going strong.